Oh, hey, you just caught me playing with myself. I mean, him.
Get on with it.
Okay, sure. So, a year ago, a woodworking gaming company released some really cool hex tiles for board games. But unfortunately for me, living in New Zealand, both the exchange rate and shipping made it pretty cost prohibitive to buy. So I figured I'd make them myself.
Yeah, you cheapskate.
So anyway, I chose to make two variations, one for holding cards and one for holding game pieces. They have magnets on the sides so they schnick together, and their rubber feet fit into the holes on the top, allowing them to stack easily for storage. They're super handy and can be used for all sorts of games, from the more complex even to the likes of Monopoly.
You mean monotony?
Yeah. I will admit though, after going through the whole process of making almost 30 of them, it is a lot of work, and I did end up spending a decent chunk of money on materials. So much so that I can't help but wonder, maybe I should have just bought them.
Can we just get on with the build now?
Yeah, sorry, let's get into it. So you might look at these hexagons and think, that's not that hard. But the really difficult part is being able to make many of them and have them all be identical. Otherwise they won't work together. And this means we're going to make a whole lot of jigs. And the first jig we're going to start off with is a sled to help cut out the hexagon shape. I'm not going to go into super detail on this jig, and there's two reasons for that. First up, the beginning is pretty much the same as my crosscut sled video, and I'll put a link on screen and in the video description if you want to check that out. But the real reason is that I'm actually using the exact jig that DIY Montreal made in their video. So I'll leave a link to that video too, as it's pretty good. You might remember that I used my bandsaw for this part of my crosscut sled. Turns out the jigsaw is much easier. So either I'm too impatient, or the glue I'm using is rubbish, or maybe MDF just doesn't glue together well. Regardless, I just squeezed some more glue into the gap and added some screws to hold the two pieces of the back fence together. And this is where things started going wrong for me. It took a long time to work out. It was because my digital protractor is not actually accurate. At this point I think my cuts are accurate, and so I'm continuing without a care in the world. And like a fool, I fully screw everything down and then do some test cuts, only to discover that I have to remove all the screws and braid nails to readjust the fence. So my next bright idea is to add a single screw for the fence to pivot on, and use my protractor to ensure it's 120 degrees to the blade, and then screw the fence down again. And this may have worked, again, if my protractor was accurate. I would then make a test cut, measure it, readjust the fence and try again. And as you can see, I made quite a few adjustments. Well, that took me a lot of back and forth, and it's mainly due to the fact that I have a faulty set of digital protractors. But eventually, you want to make sure you got 3 hexes that can join nicely in the middle like that. And if you can do that, you know that it's a perfect hexagon. I chose to make this sled adjustable so I can make any size hexagon I want. But in retrospect, I'm probably never going to use it for anything else, so I could have just screwed the side fence onto the sled directly.
Well, I've been looking forward to this part. I've bought some nice timber to make the hexes out of. I've got some white oak here. Got some rosewood. And some purple heart. That edge looks beautiful. And some black walnut. Let's get to the milling.
I start off by cleaning up a face on each board. I'm sure this gets old eventually, but I find this part super satisfying. I then move on to joint an edge on all the boards. I thought this was quite interesting. This is my purple heart after I've planed it, and it doesn't look very purple. But after you leave it a while, the purple starts to come out and it looks incredible. So that's interesting. And with the edges jointed, I bring the boards over to the table saw to rip them to just larger than the hexagons, so about 115mm or 4.5 inches. And finally back to the jointer, now transformed into a thicknesser, to clean up the final face and bring them all down to an even thickness of 20mm or just over 3/4 of an inch. Now with the boards all milled up, it's finally time to cut some hexagons. With the hexagon sled, the process is pretty simple. You use the sled to cut the first angle of the board, then you flip the board and nestle it into the crook of the 2 fences and make the second cut to get the piece that will eventually be the hexagon. Then it's just a matter of rotating that piece, sitting it into the crook of the 2 fences, making the cut and repeating until all sides are cut. Now it's just a matter of doing it 27 more times. The next step is to drill holes on the edges of the hexes to recess the magnets. I'm using a 12mm brad point bit here to be as accurate as I can. Unfortunately, I can't find the footage for this jig, but it's essentially a sandwich of plywood with small triangles in the bottom allowing me to secure the hex vertically for drilling. I also have it clamped to the drill press table so it won't move. One thing I noticed pretty quickly is even with everything clamped in place, the drill bit had a tendency to move very slightly, especially when drilling into end grain. So to counter this, I made a small L bracket that I could clamp onto the hex, and the hole in the bracket would help prevent the drill bit from wandering. And pretty soon I drilled all 28 of them. Sticking with the drill press, it's on to drilling holes for the feet and for the small tubes on the top. The jig for this one is super simple. I got 2 offcuts from making the hexes and nailed them to some plywood in such a manner that the hex nestles between them. I then clamped the jig to the drill press table so that the drill bit would come down in the correct position. With the jig in place and a depth stop set on the drill, I could go ahead and drill every second corner of the hex, giving me 3 holes in total. After drilling all the larger 8mm or 5/16 inch holes in the top of all the hexes, without moving the jig, I changed the drill bit to a 6mm or 1/4 inch drill bit and began drilling all the smaller holes on the bottoms that would later take the rubber feet. And then proceeded to drill 84 more holes. Next up is to route a dish or some lines into the middle of each hex, and to do that we're going to need another jig. What we want is something that can hold a hex securely and allows us to put a pattern over the top for a router guide bushing to follow. I start off by cutting the base of the jig out of 18mm or 3/4 inch MDF. I'm going to need several patterns and I want them all to be the same width as the base. So leaving the fence in place, I rip some 6mm or 1/4 inch MDF down to size. The pattern pieces are going to be a little shorter in width than the base. This will give me room to clamp the base to the workbench later on. I need a way of being able to secure the pattern pieces to the base and ensure they're perfectly aligned every time. To do this, I'm going to drill holes to add dowels in each corner. Before drilling the holes, I need to ensure that the patterns are exactly centered on the base. So I clamp a scrap piece of wood on one side and brad nail another piece to the edge. And because the nails are going into the edge of some MDF, they'll be able to come out easily later on. With the two pieces of scrap acting as fences, I can now position all the pattern pieces in place and move it over to the drill press to make the holes. After drilling the first hole, I add a piece of dowel to the hole to ensure there's no movement when drilling the next hole. Now I can add a dowel to the second hole, and that allows me to pull the fences off before drilling the final holes. Just in case there's any variation on where I drilled my holes, I mark the top of each piece for reference later on. I then cut 4 8mm or 5/16 inch dowels and attach them to the base of the jig. These are a really tight fit, so I don't bother with glue. And as you can see, the pattern pieces fit nice and snug over the dowels. I wanted to make a sort of cradle on the base of the jig to hold the hexes in place, directly in the centre. So after a bit of measuring, ensuring I have the hex in the exact centre, I nail a scrap of wood to the jig on both sides of the hex, ensuring the scrap is the exact thickness of the hexes, as I don't want the hex to have room to jump about while I'm routing it. To complete the cradle, I nail 2 more pieces of scrap, both cut on the hex sled, to the top and bottom of the jig, locking the hex in place. The first pattern I want to make is a simple circle to help me dish out the hexes, and the easiest way I can think to make a circle is to cut it on the lathe. So I took a square of 6mm or 1/4 inch MDF over to the lathe and cut a circle out of the middle with a parting tool. I'm going to transfer the hole onto a pattern piece using a flush trim router bit, but first I need a hole for the router to get started in. Now we're ready to dish out our first hex. You'll notice I've doubled up the pattern pieces here, and that's because my router guide bushings protruded too far from the bottom of the router and wouldn't sit flush on the top. To begin with, I'm going to use a standard router bit, as you see here, to hog out most of the material. I'm also going to use a larger guide bushing to ensure there's still enough wood left for the bowl bit to cut the right curve later on. I'm also going to set a stop point on my plunge router to ensure I only route about 10mm or 3/8 of an inch deep. I originally had my vacuum connected to the router, but unfortunately the guide bushings made it so the suction wasn't effective enough, so I resorted to pausing to vacuum when needed. Once I'd hogged out most of the material, I switched over to a bowl bit and a smaller guide bushing to complete the process. One important thing to note when routing is to take small passes. If you try and route the full depth in one pass, your bit will likely get too hot, causing burn marks and potentially damaging the bit. And as you can imagine, this process took quite some time. We still have one more pattern to make, so I can route out the lines in the card holder hexes. And after drawing a whole lot of nonsensical lines on one of my pattern pieces, I was ready to route some patterns. I used a router bit that was the exact diameter of one of my guide bushings. That way I could ensure the guide bushing could only travel side to side. Then clamping a piece of wood on as a fence for the router, I could route out the pattern lines. And here you can see the guide bushing and how it fits in the pattern. And with that pattern all made, I can attach it to the jig and using a 4mm router, route some lines across the hex. Hey wait, what's that pattern? Well, I needed to route 5 lines in each hex, but the lines for the guide bushings were too big to put all on one pattern. So I had to make 2 patterns, each with different lines, and then I could use both patterns individually on each hex. Now it's on to my favourite part, sanding. But I did have a bright idea on how to easily sand the dishes. I got another square of MDF and using my lathe I cut a circle the exact diameter of the hex into it. I then screwed a few pieces of scrap to either side of the hex to hold it in place. Then I could attach it to the lathe, turn it on and just hold the sandpaper against the spinning hex for a nice smooth finish. I then got even fancier and used a sanding mandrel on my drill to power sand it. This prevents any circle sanding lines. The rest of the sanding still sucked though. Sanding's silver lining, however, is that it's usually followed by applying finish, which is pretty satisfying. I'm using Rubio Monocoat here as it's fairly durable and I only have to apply a single coat. After leaving it for about 10 minutes to soak in, I buff it off with a rag and leave it overnight. We're on the home stretch now and it's time to insert the small pipes. I'm actually using motor bushings and they serve 2 purposes. First up, the rubber feet will slot nicely into them, making the hexes stackable. But you'll also notice that one is silver and the other 2 are bronze. This helps with magnet alignment, denoting the silver corner as the top corner. I originally thought I was going to have to glue these in, but as it turns out the holes were such a tight fit I didn't need to. Next up,
we're going to add the feet. And they are really just little rubber balls. They're called space balls, and I think they're mainly used for frame and panel doors, but they are perfect for using for feet. I don't have any fancy way of putting them in, so really I just squish them in there. And I've tried pulling them out, and once you've squished them in there, they're pretty hard to get out. But this could be another laborious process. The trick here is to kind of twist them in like you're putting a screw in. There we go. That should fit nicely on top of that. Perfect. $25 more to go. And now finally we get to put the magnets on. I got these 12mm countersunk magnets that I'm going to put in there, and when you get them you need to make sure that you get half of them facing north and half of them facing south, because what we're going to do is we're going to alternate the pole as we go around, so it'll start with north, south, north, south, north, south. As long as we replicate that exact pattern on every hex, then we can ensure that if they're all facing the right direction, they will connect no matter what the configuration. So let's get into that. So I've already done one tile, and I'm going to use that as my reference tile to make sure that I get the polarity, because I can't actually tell what's north and what's south, but as long as I get the polarity to be the same as that one, everything will be good. Haha, it's a beautiful thing. Well, that's it for this video. I hope you enjoyed watching it. I really enjoyed making it. These have come out really nicely. Like I said before, it's a lot more work than I'd bargained for, but I'm pretty happy with the result. If you want to get your hands on some of these, I'll leave a link in the video description below to the company that actually sells them. I'm not affiliated with them at all, I just think they make awesome products. As usual, if you think I earned it, smash those like and subscribe buttons, and I'll see you in the next video.